Well, I don't know what the weather is doing at your house right now, but it's raining pretty good here. The elders had encouraged me this morning to preach up a storm, but apparently with what's already been said and done, that's already happening. I want to begin with a story, and I don't oftentimes begin with stories that aren't true. I just, as a preacher, I kind of shy away from those. I doubt this one's true, but I read this story and thought that it connects in a very tangible way to what we're going to consider this morning in regard to the true story of Abraham and the covenant that God gives not only to Abraham, but the covenant that God gives to us. And so first probably a not-so-true story, and then the true story of Abraham and us. There's a man and his wife and their young children, and they're walking one day downtown near some shops. And as the man's walking by, he sees an elderly man sitting on a bench, and he recognizes the man as being one of his junior high teachers. And so he stops to greet the man, and he introduces himself. He tells the older gentleman that he had also become a teacher. He had become a teacher because of the example that this man had set for him, and also because of one particular incident when he was in his class that had changed the course of his life. The old man was intrigued, and so he asked him what incident it was that had influenced him so much. The younger man said that as they were in class, one day there was a fellow student who sat right next to him who had a watch that he had envied for a long, long time, and that student had taken his watch off and set it on the corner of his desk. And so when the other student wasn't looking, he stole the watch and he put it in his pocket. Once the student realized that the watch was missing, he told the teacher. And so the teacher made the announcement to the class that the watch had been stolen and that whoever the thief was must return it immediately. But the young man was too ashamed. So the teacher said, I want for everyone to close their eyes so that no one can see who the culprit is. And then whoever took the watch, they can hold it out and I'll come by and I'll get it, and then we can return the watch. But still, the young man was too ashamed of what he had done. The teacher then had everyone to keep their eyes closed, and he went around the classroom, pocket to pocket, until he found the watch, and then returned it. And afterwards walked back up to the front of the classroom and had everyone open their eyes. He addressed the class and he said that the watch was returned. There was no need for things to go any further. Everyone was to move on and forget about it. The younger teacher said to the retired teacher, that day was the most shameful day of my young life. But you allowed me to keep my dignity, though I had lost it in the moment. You never said a word about it to me or to anyone. You never took me aside. You never gave me a moral lesson. Yet I received the message clearly. And because of that, I am who I am today. The retired teacher looked at him and responded, I remember the situation. I remember the stolen watch. I remember looking at everyone's pocket. But I didn't remember it was you. Because when I said everyone needed to move on and to forget about it, that included me as well. I like the story. It's perhaps one of those tales where there's no way that it's true. But it's how I wanted to begin in our thinking this morning of how not only our behavior can change, but how our hearts can change. And when we're open, how our hearts can truly be transformed and changed in ways that we'd never, ever fathom. This week, our series, One Continuous Story, comes to the story of Abram. as he's called before his call. And even though this is a story that many of us are familiar with, and we're going to perhaps take a very quick glance at the story of Abraham. There's so many other details to explore. I want to encourage us, for those of us who are at least familiar with the story, to hear this story and to hear these promises from God to Abram at his call, and to hear them perhaps for the first time as we consider a few key aspects of this true story that connect to our stories as well. So look with me, if you will, Genesis chapter 12. We're going to look at four different passages from the book of Genesis. Genesis, which is a book of beginnings. This first passage found in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you." And so Abram left as the Lord had told him. Interesting, if you're looking, most of our translations will render the word Lord in all capitals, L-O-R-D. That's designating that the covenant name of God, Yahweh, is being utilized here. So Abram left as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out for Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the side of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So Abram, he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Verses 8 and 9, from there he went on toward the east hills of Bethel and pitched his tent in Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord. And he called on the name of the Lord. Abram building these altars to God, worshiping God. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Let's stop there. God, He singles out, He pursues. God, He chooses Abram. He chooses Abram to bless. Now, Abram, as we'll see here in a few moments, who God changes his name to Abraham. Abram demonstrates faith. And he's known as a man of faith. But what I want for us to center upon is that God, He calls Abram, He calls him from his less than ordinary life when he was nothing more than a pagan nomad. Don't miss this. I mean, we kind of tend to back up as we consider this story, especially as we're more familiar with it. And yes, we know that God sees the big picture. Yes, we know that God knows the totality of the story. If you fast forward to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 8, it reads, "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and he went, even though he didn't know where he was going." In that great chapter of faith, Hebrews chapter 11, the name Abraham appears a couple of different times. Abraham, he obeyed and went. Abraham, he obeyed and he went. Because it's not faith. It's not faith without obedience. But don't miss that Father Abraham who had many sons. I realize that now some of you are beginning to sing the song, and you're welcome. But don't miss this. Abram, as God singles him out, as God pursues him, Abram is nothing special. As a matter of fact, he's got quite a few cards stacked against him, and there are a few of them, if you read his entire story, he's going to stack against himself. But God calls Abram from his less than ordinary life, not when he is faithful, not when he is a believer, but when he is a pagan nomad, to be his servant. And church, there is hope in that. There is hope in recognizing that our God is not limited by any situation or any circumstance. And what was it that he promised Abram? We'll see this later affirmed to Isaac and Jacob and Moses whenever we get to those stories. But what did God promise? 7 different promises here in Genesis 12. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, saying to Abram, nothing's going to stand in your way. And then finally, all people on earth are going to be blessed through you. All people on earth are going to be blessed through you. God calls Abram and says to this guy who doesn't even have any children and is an old man that his descendants are going to bless the whole world. All right, stick with me. I said 4 different passages. Turn with me to the second passage, just a page or two further in Genesis chapter 15. God, he takes Abram outside at night. Whenever he's questioning, how is it possible that God can do all of what he's promising? In Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, the Lord, he took him outside. And he said to Abram, I love this, look up at the heavens. Look up to the heavens, count the stars, if you can indeed count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be. This old man who has no children, look to the heavens, count the stars, so shall your descendants be. In this moment, God is making a promise that he will keep for all time, and a promise that connects to us in this one continuous story. And then verse 6, something beautiful happens. Abram believed God, and the text says that God credited it to him as righteousness. God acknowledged to him righteousness. That God gives to him, acknowledges to him, recognizes to him his righteous state. And it's not just that God promised it. It's not just God had promised all of these things, that your descendants are going to be as vast as the stars in the night sky. It's not just that God promised this. Abram believed it. Turn a page or two further to Genesis chapter 17, beginning in verse 4. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you the father of many nations. In the Bible, many times, when there is a change of heart, when there is a change of status, when there is a change of relationship, there's also a change of name. And so God, he gives Abram a new name, Abraham, because his status has changed in his eyes. Stick with me, verses 6 and following. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you. Kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and to your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for generations to come. You see, God He's a covenant God. God is a covenant maker. Covenant is deeper than relationship. Oftentimes we connect the two. But covenant is not only a relationship, there's an agreement that's in place. God is a covenant God. God is a covenant maker. God is a covenant keeper. If you continue reading there, you'll see that God will go on to explain the mark of the covenant in circumcision. I wish God would have chosen some other marker, but He didn't. As a matter of fact, Paul will come along later on as he writes to the believers in Colossae, and he'll say that baptism connects to this mark of the covenant. That as we, as New Testament believers, as we connect to these promises of God, that as we're baptized into Christ, that the waters of baptism communicate to us, to the world, what God has done, what God is doing within us. Paul will say it's a circumcision of the heart. There's a cutting away of flesh, of the fleshly nature of ourselves, so that the spiritual nature of God can reside and dwell within us. Genesis chapter 22, this fourth passage in Genesis. This is Abraham as he's tested at Mount Moriah in regard to the child of the promise, Isaac, which we're going to spend our time with next week if you're reading ahead. But just verses 17 and 18. Genesis 22, 17 and 18. I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the night sky, in the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Can you imagine, as there are some 25 years in between God making the initial promises to Abram and God fulfilling those promises through Isaac, his son. Can you imagine how, as there's 25 years from when God makes these promises to Abraham and when they actually come into being, can you imagine Abraham stepping outside at night, night after night after night, and looking to the stars, considering the sand on the seashore, trusting in God, trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense, all the while trusting that God is God, especially when it made no sense. The story of Abraham is a story of trust. Abraham trusted. He trusted the God who can be trusted. The story of Abraham is also a story of obedience. Abraham not only trusts God, but he obeys God. You see, so often we want to see, we want to know, we struggle and we doubt and we fear, and maybe even if we don't verbalize the words, within us we wrestle with this question of, can God be trusted? When God has demonstrated His trustworthiness to us throughout Scripture, and if we'll pay attention throughout our lives. And so often we struggle and we doubt and we fear without ever giving a thought to what God calls us to above and beyond all of that. Obedience. obedience. There is this theme that's found throughout the Bible. Look at the great heroes of faith, all of the men and women of faith in the Bible. There is this theme that is found woven throughout the biblical text. That these great heroes of faith, they do not often have all of the details. But still, they trust God. God says, Abraham, the world is going to be blessed by you. The world is going to be blessed through you. Just trust me and just obey me. And Abraham does. My family had a Shih Tzu dog. Max was his name. He passed away last year. He was 14. And Max was awesome. And he was the family dog, truth be told. He was my oldest daughter Casey's dog. But Max was great. He was an inside dog. And the thing about Max is he didn't really care. He just kind of did his own thing. Now Max and I had a really good relationship, and I could at times instruct Max, sit. And sometimes he would do it on the spot, no problem. Other times, Max, sit. And he wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to do it because he didn't feel like it. If he didn't feel like it, he didn't do it because Max kind of did his own thing. You know, the longer I live and the longer I am a Christian, the more I am convinced that you and I, we don't have a knowledge problem. Even though recognizing that studies demonstrate that Christians today know less of these stories of the Bible, that Christians today know less than previous generations of Christians. But the longer I'm a Christian and the longer I'm a person who's seeking to follow Christ, the more I become aware that we don't have a knowledge problem. We have an obedience problem. Too often we're like Max. We sit whenever we very well please. Are we going to be obedient and faithful people? That's the question that's derived out of the story of Abraham. Are we going to be obedient and faithful people? Abraham, the whole world is going to be blessed by you. This is what God promises. And this promise is ultimately fulfilled in the story of Jesus. And the Bible instructs that not only is this promise ultimately fulfilled in the story of Jesus, this promise is ultimately fulfilled in us as our stories connect to the greater story of God. God calls Abraham to create Israel so that through Christ he might redeem the world, so that through us others might come to know this God of the promise. We skip to the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, writing to Christians in Galatia, he writes this, Galatians 3, verses 6 through 9. Consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. That's us. Paul, seeing this great story and how we connect to this greater story of God, those who believe, he says, are children of Abraham, descendants of Abraham. Verses 8 and 9, the Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles. How? Justified by faith. Faith which is more than belief. Faith is our belief in action. Faith is only faith when it's coupled with obedience. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. Now this is significant. We tend to think of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, what God accomplishes on our behalf through Christ, on the cross, through the resurrection, as something that's relegated to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, revealed and articulated throughout the New Testament text. But Paul says this has always been the plan of God. This has always been the story of God. And he connects this announcement of gospel to Abraham, that all the world, all nations, verse 8, all nations will be blessed through you. So that those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. You see, you and I, we are the people of God. We are, and maybe we're not comfortable with this sort of concept, but just as God creates and fashions physical Israel through these promises in the Old Testament, you and I, we're spiritual Israel today. We're the people of God today. God engaging in covenant relationship with us through the gospel today. Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, the apostle affirms, if you belong to Christ, you're Abraham's children. You connect with these promises. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's children, and you're heirs according to the promise. The truth that all people on earth are going to be blessed through God's promise to Abraham is only truly fulfilled in the gospel of Christ and through us. And think about it, as we become a part of the family of God, as God adopts us into His family, as we obey, as we submit to Him. We get a new name, just like Abraham. God, He calls us and He saves us, especially when we don't deserve Him. And He gives us new names as we're adopted into His family. He calls us blessed. He calls us redeemed, saved, forgiven. He calls us made new, just like God called Abraham. Abraham, who didn't even know God prior to his call, but who's open. Abraham, his heart is open. And God can do something with that in each of us. God offers covenant. He offers blessing. He offers promise. And for Abraham, it's because his heart is open and because he obeys that everything changes. And the same thing goes for us. When we are open to God, when we accept God not only by believing in Him, but by submitting to Him in baptism, by living a life in covenant with Him through Christ. When we're open to God, when we accept God, and live a life defined by God and characterized by God, and lives that honor God and glorify God. When our hearts are open, they have to be open, everything changes. And the promise is, not only are we blessed, but the world is blessed through us. Our families, those who have been entrusted to us, are blessed through us. Others are blessed through us as we love God and as we love others. And so a couple of questions to bring things to a close today. What are you doing right now as a person of faith to bless the world? I don't think that's too broad of a question to ask. What are you doing right now as a person of faith to bless the world, to bless others, to bless and to love and to minister to those around you? We've had weeks of this, I guess what we could call at this point a new normal. We've had weeks of this new normal, and most likely we've got weeks, if not longer, to go. What are you doing right now with the opportunities that God has entrusted to you? I mean, think about it. You can only binge watch so much television, right? What are you doing right now with the eternal things that God has entrusted to you? Are you loving God and are you loving others through all of this? How are you making someone else's life blessed because you're in it? How can you do a better job over these next few weeks than perhaps you have in the last few weeks in being a person of faith? My hope is that this empty building this morning would remind us that the church is always gathered in order to scatter. That this empty building might be a reminder that we are on mission for God. And the mission is in place wherever we are placed by God. And that our faith is in our God. Our faith is in our God who is faithful and who does not falter. And who knows, maybe lately we've been reminded when health and economy and government all fail and falter, God is the constant. God can be trusted. Our call is to stand in obedient faith and trust our God. To stand in obedient faith and trust our God who is faithful and who blesses the world through us.